May I introduce our first speaker, Dr. Densil Morgan. He is going to speak about William Evans of Rhymney at Cyfaill Eglwysig. Now, William Evans was one of the diligent priests in Llawdden valleys, who was vicar of Rhymney for over half a century. One of the leaders of the evangelical faction, not only was he an important figure in the Diocese of Cyfaill, but he made an important contribution to through a Cyfaill Eglwysig, one of the leading church periodicals. Densil Morgan is one of the joint editors of the Gofal volume, and he's already made a major contribution to this series of talks. A native of Morriston in the Swansea Valley, and he was Professor of Theology at the University, and then at the University of Wales, Trinity St David's at Lampeter. He's now Professor Emeritus there, and a minister in charge of the Baptist churches of the Northern Tavy area. He's published many works on theology and religion in Wales, and his latest volume is Gras Gobaith a Gogoniant, Religion and Spirituality in the work of Eglwysig 1, which was published last year. Welcome, Densil. Thank you, Howell, for those kind words. Now, sir, you have the satisfaction of knowing that you are helping not a dying church, not a decaying church, but a living, reviving, a rising church. We have quiet days for our clergy, special missions for the people. They are multiplying all round throughout the length and breadth of the principality. When the Reverend William Evans of Rhymney penned those words in correspondence with the officer of the Church Pastoral Aid Society in 1887, the revival in the spiritual life of the Church in Wales, which has been such a prominent theme in this series of Gofal, was in full force. Although some discord between chapel and church did exist, this was before the battle over disestablishment, which created some vicious polarisation amongst Welsh Christians, had really begun. And when the Welsh language had attained almost 1 million speakers, more than ever before in the nation's history. Religious life and popular culture alike flourished, and through his influential preaching, his detailed pastoral work, and his efforts in editing a Cyfaill, Welsh Anglicans' most useful journal at the time, the Vicar of Rhymney, in the midst of this hive of activity, and he's the subject of this session. William Evans was born in the parish of Llawdden, Carmarthenshire, in 1823. Son of a farmer and his wife, were loyal and devotional church members. The rector of Llawdden at the time was Alfred Owen, vice principal of St David's College, Lampeter. He remained in the parish during college vacations. One of the reasons for this being well, the vicar of the parish was the Reverend John Griffith, one of several John Griffith or John Griffiths who were prominent priests in the church in Wales at the time, and who would later be appointed vicar of Llawdden. They would both make a great impression on the youth, former in formulating his doctrinal convictions, and the latter as an example of an eloquent preacher. This is what Canon T. Jesse Jones said in his biography. The rector was a brilliant and renowned theologian, and the vicar was an evangelical preacher of exceptional ability and influence. He was called the Golden-Tongued John of Wales. The boy had the privilege of being easily and thoroughly indoctrinated in our creed by the former. From the latter, he gained a desire to preach and learned his organised melodious and effective method of communicating the vital truths for the salvation of mankind. Despite these noted clerical examples, he was intended to be a farmer, and he was 23 years of age before he decided to train for the priesthood. In order to prepare for entry to St. David's College, he spent a period at the grammar school in Newgate, and he was so successful in the entrance exam that he won a full scholarship, subsequently winning college prizes in Hebrew and theology. He'd remained a hard-working and conscientious student all his life. But since St. David's College didn't at the time offer bachelor's degrees, Evans graduated as a licentiate. He was ordained deacon by Conor Thirlwell, Bishop of St. David's, in 1848, and ordained priest a year later. He served as curate of St. Mary's Cardigan for 2 years, before moving to the Diocese of St. Arve in 1851 as curate in charge of the extensive parish of Llawdden. Llawdden was an extensive rural parish on the verge of industrial activity, with an income of £600 per annum, considerable sum in those days. The rector was Thomas Dacey, a graduate of Jesus College, Oxford, who lived in Cardiff while serving the fashionable parish of St. John's. He was brother-in-law to the clerk of justices in Cardiff and the town clerk. He was among the chosen favourites of the second Marquess of Bute and was chaplain to Llawdden Raith. He employed 2 curates, one to care for Llawdden itself, and another to administer to the Chapel of Ease at Bristir, between Nant Bargoed Rhymney and the river, and paid them £150 between them. He himself earned £600. No wonder Canon Jesse Jones, who himself served as rector of Llawdden at the end of the century, said, Mr. Dacey was well accustomed to the good things in life. By the time William Evans arrived in the parish, there was a new bishop of St. Arve, none other than Alfred Ollivant, former vice principal of St. David's College, and the man who was rector of Llangelier when the new curate was a lad. He brought pressure to bear on Stacey at last to pay his curate honourably, in Evans's case £120 per annum, together with the use of the rectory and garden. He arrived late at night after a long and tiring journey, and since the rectory was empty, he went to the local public house for something to eat, and there met, and I quote here, tall, muscular and bony person sitting in the parlour, a gun by his side, and 2 dogs lying by the bench where he sat. Since the man was dressed in a crimson velvet jacket, the famished pilgrim assumed that he was some sort of gentleman's gamekeeper. Without exchanging a word, the hunter left, and when the new curate reached the rectory after finishing his meal, who opened the door for him? But the man in the velvet jacket. This was the curate of the parish, not anyone's gamekeeper, said the biographer. And this was a reflection of the change afoot in the church in Wales at the time. The old, comfortable, indolent and spiritually impoverished order was giving way to a generation of dedicated and responsible clerics who took their pastoral and missionary duties seriously. In the words of the biographer, the old curate left, and with him departed the old order. The new order arrived as a knight equipped for work. And that's exactly what happened. The congregations he inherited were small. According to the 1851 religious census, The average number of attendees at the Welsh morning service was 27, with only 9 for the afternoon service. And through regularly visiting parishioners' homes, the numbers increased significantly in a short time, and he established an evening service, although the people had to bring their own candles. St Catherick's Church building was old and inviting. Few seats there were uncomfortable, a few shaky and ancient benches, according to the biography. Although he became increasingly popular with the people, his zeal didn't appeal to the wardens. And although they opposed him, he knew that he had the bishop side. He held out, and in time there was a thorough revival. Evening services were held at Llawdden, says the biographer, and the congregations were numerous. Seating was obtained and paid for, as were the candles, and this was done voluntarily, without burdening the parish with tax, nor forcing the wardens to collect and install them. The spiritual life of the church was renewed. He was welcomed in every household, and all regarded him as a beneficial and pleasant friend. The curate was unmarried, and although popular, he had no close friends among the flock. He kept himself to himself when he was at college, and although he was by now a successful pastor, he tended to turn to his books for comfort and company. The parish of Llawdden bordered the parish of Rhymney at the junction of the counties of Brecknock, Glamorgan and Monmouthshire, and Evans knew that Lord Edward, vicar there since 1843, had not only enjoyed particular success in his ministry, but every Monday evening held a meeting of communicants, a kind of experience association on the Methodist pattern, although run on church nights. Such is the zeal and good sense of that excellent man, Godric Edwards, said Edward Copleston, Oliver's predecessor, as Bishop of Llawdden. He has already 200 communicants in his church, and that was only a year after he was established there. Evans started attending the communicants regularly, and as well as deriving benefit from the fellowship, it provided an opportunity to foster his public talents. Well, that is, in Rhymney, his experiences and prayers flowed forth as a crystal stream from the pure depths of his existence. It's the biographer who says that, a rather flowery language. And being able to experience evangelistic zeal in a populous industrial parish was for him a great inspiration, and the fellowship of the association helped to alleviate his loneliness. He stayed for 3 years at Llawdden, and with the great disappointment of his parishioners, as well as Bishop Owen. In 1854, he returned to Dyfed and a curacy in the parish of Troed yr Aur in Ceredigion, a little to the north, near Castle Emlyn. He was then 31 years old. Now, the details are few, but it does appear that William Evans went there to marry, and according to the biography, they were very dear to each other, and there never was a happier or more hopeful union than this marriage. Soon afterwards, events took another turn. In Rhymney, Lord Edwards died, still a comparatively young man, and a replacement was needed. He'd have to be an energetic man of evangelical bent and sympathetic to the work already done. so as to build on his predecessor's success. One of the singular features of the parish of Rhymney was that the local iron company was sympathetic to the church. They'd sponsored the church's work, paid for the erection of St David's Church in 1843, and contributed in part to the priest's stipend. Now, this could have given the ironmasters an unfair advantage, but their motives appear to be normal. Most appear to be of the opinion that they genuinely cared for their workers and their families. The owners approached the congregation and asked them to propose the names of 3 persons who, in their opinion, would be his successor. Unsurprisingly, the name of the curate of Troederair was one of the 3. And this is what Jesse Jones has to say. The 3 nominees were all excellent men, but in the opinion of the bishop, William Evans was head and shoulders above the other 2. So, our hero, without himself making any appeal or request, became vicar of Rhymney in the year 1856. From then on until his death in 1900, he'd be known to all as William Evans of Rhymney. Evans inherited a prosperous parish, possibly the most prosperous in the entire diocese. One thing, it was a new parish, established by Act of Parliament in 1839, and before the nonconformist chapels had an opportunity to put down roots. The church itself was in the centre of the town, rather than in a remote spot away from the centre of population. Rhymney was part of the large former parish of Bedwellty, and its medieval church was miles away on top of the mountain. The type of ministry was one which the workers and their families could appreciate. Fiery evangelical preaching, such as were found in the Bible, Sunday school, societies, and prayer meeting, which would give the laity a chance to practice their skills. And most of this was through the reading of Welsh. According to the 51 census, as many as 700 attended Sunday school, and was more than likely catered for adults as well as children. Although he appreciated the patronage and support of the Iron Company, the new vicar was very much alive to the risk that he could be regarded as the servant of the company rather than the servant of the Lord. So, as to ensure a distance, metaphorical and literal, between himself and the employers, he obtained Bishop Olivan's permission to reside outside the parish, and he and his wife settled in a home called Densil, a rural spot about a mile from the town, across the river, in the parish of Cyfaill. Whatever their initial married bliss might have been, sadness overtook them in 1860, when their 2 children died, 2 boys, one aged 5 and the other in infancy. Another son and a daughter were born to them. But when the daughter, Sarah, reached the age of 5 in 1866, she also died, to their great distress, particularly to the mother. In her grief, she sought solace in the bottle. And if that wasn't enough, within a few months, Martha, the maidservant at Nantles, was murdered. And although the suspect was brought before Brecon Assizes, there wasn't enough evidence to convict him. By now, his wife's alcoholism having become common knowledge, Evans had to take a few months' leave. And then in 1868, his wife died. She was only 39 years old. The neighbourhood sympathised with the vicar rather than condemning him. as a widower with a young boy to raise on his own. To escape from his sorrows, he threw himself with renewed vigour into his ministry. And according to Jesse Jones, Mr. Evans at that time preached with a heavenly inspiration. The aisles were filled, communicants multiplied, and church Sunday schools became its glory. Compared with a nonconformist, the churchman's ventures into magazine publishing were scarce and sporadic. Gwyliadydd, the Journal of the Old Literary Parsons, came to an end in 1839. David Owen Brutus began his mission in this building at Hael in 1835. The Eglwysig lasted between 1847 and 64, and Banner y Groes, the Welsh periodical of the Oxford movement, edited by Abython, would continue between 1854 and 58. But in 1862, from Spurrell's Press in Carmarthen, there appeared the first issue of a new Anglican periodical, a Cyfaill Eglwysig. According to T.J.S. Jones and others who followed in his wake, it was established by David Howell Llawdden, although the periodical itself doesn't mention this. The editors of the first issues, which appeared between January and December 1862, were John Morgan, curate of Aberafan, and Ivan Jones, Ieuan Gwennog, vicar of Llanbihangel Araf. From January 1863 until December 1864, Ieuan Gwennog, together with William Evans, were the editors. Then throughout 1865 to 66, Evans, jointly with Benjamin Williams Gwynionydd, edited it. And for the next quarter of a century, between 1867 and 1893, sole editor was the Vicar of Rhymney. Unlike Brutus, satire and scorn weren't William Evans' forte. Although an uncompromising churchman, he didn't, on the whole, wish to denigrate the nonconformist, but rather emphasized what he saw as the superiority of the established church, its form of services, link with the state, and care for all, not merely its own members. He says this in 1869, the jealousy of nonconformity is certain to slay the remnants of religion remaining in its own breast. Everything demands that every churchman should be vigilant, faithful, energetic, adhering adamantly to our country's ancient apostolic church, not paying evil for evil or censure for censure, but rather praying, blessing, and loving. The editor of a Cyfaill was neither a poet nor a historian, and unlike the old literary parson, it doesn't appear to be very interested in antiquity. Although articles of an historical nature do appear from time to time, and poems and hymns are included in the periodical, it was by no means an Eisteddfodic publication. Rather, it was a practical magazine with the aim of fostering religion and the spiritual life, and enlightening church congregations as to the base of their faith. One of the central features of the provision of material for Sunday school: stories, lessons on the catechism, and when Solfa became popular, music lessons as well. The Sunday school is an important institution. It is the nursery of the church. Wherever there is a prosperous Sunday school, there is a numerous congregation. And not only that, there's also better listening, better singing, and better responses in all the divine services. As the tendency of the age is to turn away from the Bible in everyday school, So we are called to redouble our efforts at Sunday school. Let every churchman resolve to do his best for Sunday school. In his own parish, the one thing which he did not neglect was the work of the Sunday school, and the Cyfaill contains frequent reports of activities. David Jones, his successor as editor in 1894, said, "There are in Wales no Sunday schools more flourishing than the church Sunday school in Rhymney." A part of the periodical's mission was to promote similar activity everywhere else. When addressing a diocesan conference in Llandaw in the same year, 1894, the rector of Tredegar said of him, "There is no one who has done more for the church press than he. He has done it quietly, and not impatiously, but very effectively. Cyfaill is a little lazy. It's quite the thing, teaching for the ordinary Welsh reader." And again, it gives instruction on various general matters, as well as church questions. And at the close of the Cyfaill each month, it's an epitome of church, not only in Wales, but in the English diocese also. But Cyfaill Eglwysig was an ostentatious, simple and popular magazine, which all parts of the country, and it made the name of William Evans known to church people throughout Wales. As he was by now well known throughout the land, he had the opportunity to preach another day, as well as in his own. Very often, when new churches were opened, he was the visiting preacher. And the fact that so many were being opened was proof of the progress made by the church in this time. Those who remember half a century ago, he said in 1887, can hardly believe that such regeneration, revival, and increase has taken place in the church of the land, the old church of their fathers. Despite its many tribulations which have and still assail her, the roots are firm, and she bears fruit, spreading branches in all directions. Evans grew to be a man of note in the diocese, acting as rural dean, and then from 1878 on, honorary canon of the cathedral. The link between him and Bishop Llawdden was close. He kept a portrait of the bishop on the wall of study throughout his career. He was elected to represent his fellow clergymen at the Convocation of Canterbury, and he'd go to London for their meetings every year. But he never denied his Welshness, nor his roots among the common people. "I am a Welshman," he told the officers, a fellow Welshman, a Welshman of the Welsh. "I love its people and I love its language. I speak to my fellow countrymen every day. I preach to them in weak, dear old mother tongue, the melodious tongue on the face of the earth." How those words went down in London, we don't know. Be that as it may. He was happiest at home amongst his people. The day's work would begin at about 9 in the morning, when he'd get up. He was a night owl, reading in his study until about 2 in the morning, before going to bed. Margaret, the maid, would arrive at about mid-morning, by which time he'd performed his devotion and was preparing for the day. He walked into town daily, along the path and across the river, and would visit the sick and the needy. Returned to Nantes by mid-afternoon for a lunch, prepared by Margaret, and after relaxing for an hour, he'd return again for the evening meetings. Meetings of communicants on Monday, then the prayer meeting, choir practice, Land of Hope, Temperance Meeting, and Bible study for young people. Only free evenings for Friday and Saturday. He'd prepare carefully, especially for the pulpit. The pulpit, it may be said, is his throne, said Davis Jones, his successor as editor. And the two poles of his sermon are man's sin and God's grace, the depth of the fall and the height of resurrection. He was never guilty of deprecating the sacraments, Jesse Jones then said, but he considered preaching as one of the most important duties of his ministry. There's a difference there in the emphasis of the evangelical priests and other priests. The high point of the Great Harvest Festival is preaching. And this festival would last 2 days at the beginning of autumn and would attract large congregations. Preachers David Parry Llawdden, Dr. Llandale, George Griffith Mahadiev, and everyone's favourite, Llawdden, and we'll hear more of him next conversation from him. At the time when the nonconformist preaching meetings attracted the crowd, the church in Wales, in Rhymney at any rate, wasn't far behind. But again, the most important thing, in his opinion, was the daily duties of the parish. The mark of the sermons, prayers of the faithful pastor, can be seen in every branch of work in the parish. And I'm looking at the clock. In late 1893, William Evans suffered paralysis or a stroke, and from then on, his health deteriorated rapidly. He had to give up the editorship of the Cyfaill. The Harvest Preaching Festival came to an end, and with it, most of his public duties. It was the curate now who undertook the responsibilities of the parish, and he became increasingly dependent on the friendship of his younger neighbour, the Reverend T. Jesse Jones, who was by then vicar of Eglwysig. Margaret the maid cared for him in his last illness, and he died, aged 76, on the 9th of August, 1900, having served as vicar of Rhymney for the last 44 years. She rose no higher in the hierarchy of the church in Wales, and to all appearances wouldn't have wished to do so. In his tribute to him in the Cyfaill, the editor of the Reverend said, Cyfaill has lost one of his staunchest friends. The church has lost one of its most diligent pastors, one of its most inspired preachers, and one of its truest sons. Rest now, man of God. One aim of the Gofal in Gwynplaine series is to ensure that the sterling contribution of such stalwarts isn't forgotten. Thank you very much. Thank you, Densil. That raises many questions. If I can just quickly ask, was William Evans ever considered for appointment as a bishop? When Gladstone considered that a matter of importance, as with the appointment of Joshua Hughes in 1870. I find it odd, bearing in mind how prominent William Evans was, that his name wasn't at least mentioned when Gladstone was seeking a suitable candidate. Why not William Evans? Well, one reason, his wife. She'd recently died, and it was well known that she'd been an alcoholic. The reason Joshua Hughes had married into the aristocracy, and if he hadn't married well or wisely, I doubt whether he'd have been appointed, because Joshua Hughes and William Evans were very similar. These who came from among the common people, but a bishop would be required to mix with the gentry. And William Evans was one of the people. He was made a canon, but no more than that. Yes. The first Welshman to be appointed. Since the time of Queen Anne, I think William Evans would have made a very good bishop. I'm sure he would. Any more questions?
Pwy ddilynnodd William Evans yn Rhymney wedyn, achos oedd 'na duedd yn doedd erbyn y cyfnod ni
No.
I offeiriad Efengyliaeth cael ei ddisodli
Nothing on the screen.
Wel, uchod Eglwysig felly,
If I can ask one question.
Digwyddodd hynny ddim yn Rhymney. Dyn Efengylaeth
Followed William Evans in Rhymney, because there was a tendency then for evangelical priests to be succeeded by those who, well, more high church tendency. That didn't happen in Rhymney. He was followed by an evangelical preacher. Bishop wasn't as good as William Evans, but as regards doctrine, because not in the religious census, in the books prepared for the disestablishment, there's a detailed report from the parish of Rhymney for the authorities, and it appears that the evangelical fervour continued. And there's an opportunity now to introduce our second speaker, Dr. Siôn Owen, who will speak about Llawdden, poet, dean and prophet, and his contribution to the life of the church, particularly in the Diocese of St. David's. It may be said of him that he was an advance of his time, particularly in regard to his comments about the religious revival, 1904-05. And we look forward to hearing what Siôn Owen has to say about this. Siôn Owen was born in Bangor, gained doctorates in theology and in bilingual education. He's lived and worked in Wales, in England, in Scotland and Australia, and is currently tutor in Welsh theology at St. Paddy's Institute, Llandaff. Siôn, of course, is a poet, Welsh, English, and occasionally in Latin, and he won the crown at the National Eisteddfod in Llawdden in 1980. He also contributed poems on topical subjects, and his latest volume in 2021 was Through a Flower, collaboration with the artist Iwan Bala. He was established as Canon Brifad at Bangor Cathedral in 2023, and in 2008 he also won the title of Mastermind Cymru. We look forward very much to Siôn Owen's contribution.
Pawb yn gweld ac yn clywed hyn gobeithio. Yeah.
Well, thanks for the introduction. At least it shows I've travelled much in different ways during my life. So, can you all see that? So, I'm going to share some details, not as many as Densil had about Evans, but what struck me as important about David Howell, the man who took the bardic name of Llawdden, to which we'll return later. Dean David Howell came to my attention was when I was researching the 1904-1906 revival, and the way he was considered a kind of precursor of the revival. So, to summarise what I have to share this morning: biography, his characteristics as a Christian and as a minister, and the question, was he a prophet of the revival? And then, at the end, I want to discuss some of the implications of his ministry for today. And I hope we'll be able to discuss these further, as we did with the ministry of William Evans in the conversation at the end. So, life. He was born in Llawdden, in the Vale of Glamorgan. And it's important to remember that the Vale, at that time, was somewhere where the Welsh language flourished to a degree. The Vale is one of those interesting places where you see the ebb and flow in the fortune of the language over the centuries. It's an area which was very quickly taken over by the Normans following the conquest. But the Welsh language advance came back and then retreated. But by the mid-19th century, the language was very much alive. His mother died young, and he was brought up to a large degree by his grandmother, who was a church member. His immediate family were Calvinistic Methodists, but he felt the influence of the church through his grandmother. He then moved to Bryn Cwtyn, a farm near Pencoed. I researched into what happened to Bryn Cwtyn, and it seems that it's now disappeared under a housing estate close to the M4 as you leave Pencoed, which is a junction and a railway station of the M4.
Gaerdydd. Ond
And it's more or less
roedd o'n ffermio
a sort of dormitory for Cardiff.
John Howell ac
But there,
ynnol a llawer o
he
teulu
farmed with his
John
father,
Howell yn flaenor
John Howell,
gyda'r Methodistiaid Calfinaidd.
and like much of the family,
Bangor,
John Howell was a deacon with the Calvinistic Methodist. At Pencoed, he met the woman who would later become his wife, Anne Howell. And that point in his life story will feature significantly later on. He came to the attention of John Griffiths, rector of St Mary's Church, again in the Vale of Glamorgan, and he attended the Eagle School. Now, I researched a bit about this Eagle School, since the name sounded rather interesting. Was the idea that you soared as eagles after attending it? Not quite so romantic, I'm afraid. The Eagles, or the Spread Eagle, the name seems to have varied over the years, was a public house. And this is what it looked like a few years ago. A large building with an extensive hall at the back. The school was in operation for a large part of the 19th century. And interestingly, Iolo Morgannwg's children were sent there, and two of them were girls. It appears that this school was unusual, very unusual, in that it accepted boys and girls. And perhaps it's time that somebody researched a bit more into the history and influence of the Eagle School and the influence it had on the people. It was a fee-paying institution, so it wasn't a school for the poor, but it does seem to have influenced a number of people who themselves became prominent later on. He then went on to a preparatory school to prepare for further education and specifically prepare for the ministry. And then to the Diocesan Institute at Llandaff at Abergavenny. He was ordained deacon in 1855 and priested the following year, as was usual in those days. And he became curate of Neath from 1855 to 59. We've already heard of Bishop Ollivant, a man who, as we've heard, learned Welsh and was in favour of the language. But he seems to have had doubts about John Howell, not because of any character defect, but because he wasn't a graduate. and Oliphant, like many bishops, favoured ordaining graduates only. However, David Howell managed to jump that particular hurdle to obtain his curacy in Neath. And then, during that period, he became secretary of the Church Pastoral Aid Society, which heard about from Densil. It was a very influential evangelical organization with an emphasis on mission and offering grants, well, indeed it still does, for missionary work, particularly, and it originated from the CMS, the Church Missionary Society, for which I worked in the 80s, as it happened. The CMS, the Church Missionary Society, and now the Church Mission Society. And to oversimplify, perhaps, the supporters of the CMS, which was also mostly a foreign missionary society or body, became increasingly to realize that there was work to be done at home as well. One of the key persons in the establishment of CPAS was the man whose picture you see on the right here, Lord Shaftesbury. Shaftesbury was a Tory, but very enthusiastic proponent of social justice. Strange how these political labels can change their meaning over time, such as the label of Republican and Democrat in America, as we know only too well these days. The Shaftesbury was very active for Christian ministry and associated it very much with a social mission. His son, Ashley, came into contact with Thomas Richards, another of the literary parsons who sought to further the Welsh language at the time. And Shaftesbury learned quite a lot of Welsh to, well, an extensive degree. So there are considerable links with his family, with Wales. Be that as it may, Llaw then became secretary of the society, and his attendance at the annual meetings was notable. And there were specific annual meetings for Wales, as the society recognised the distinctive nature of the country. And at these meetings, Llawdden would pray fervently for an outpouring of the Holy Spirit on their work. And that is a sign, perhaps, of his own spiritual tendencies and his enthusiasm for this type of work. The combination of the missionary, spiritual and social. I mentioned that I've been something of a wanderer during my life. Well, so was Llawdden. He ministered in Pwllheli in 1861 to 64, St John's in Cardiff, in the middle of Cardiff, and we'll come back to that. Wrexham, Resford, nearby. And he was honorary canon of St Asaph, and then Archdeacon of Wrexham, and ended his life as Dean of St David's. This is his tomb at St David's Cathedral, and the verse from the book of Daniel, and those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky above, and those who turn many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever, which is an appropriate description of his ministry. His children erected a memorial to him, which is located close to his tomb in St David's Cathedral. And we shall return to the inscription later on. What were the features of his ministry? This shows St John's Church in the centre of Cardiff as it stands today. A church which is a venue not only for Sunday congregations, but for prayer meetings and other weekday gatherings at lunchtime for those working in the city. And it is located almost at the dead centre of the city. And Llawdden was rector there. And had the care also of a number of other churches in the area. And this was what was written about him at the time when he left his ministry in the Cardiff Weekly. And by the way, I'm very much indebted to the work of Roger Brown on David Howell's life. And although I haven't made many references in this presentation, I shall be doing so in the next volume of Gofal ein Gwynllan presentations. And Roger found
Because as
This
new energy and power,
rotation,
church became more effective.
new life was apparent everywhere.
And the results were
As
clear.
to new energy and power,
Without
the church became more effective
charities were
in
awakened,
administrations,
and dormant
and the results were clearly perceptible without.
Neither
Fresh
the
charities
direct
were
charismatic
awakened,
nor were its
dormant
results
faculties
temporary.
were quickened
Time
into
was
life.
failures to describe
Neither was the
the
effect
agency
spasmodic,
which the
nor were
restorative
its results
energy of
temporary.
the vicar called
Time would fail
into
us to
existence.
describe the new
Suffice it
agencies
to state
with the
that
restless
in
energy
lieu of
of
a
the vicar
pathetic and thin
called into
congregation,
existence.
enthusiastic
I
and
suggested
crowded
that in lieu
assemblies
of
meet
apathetic
together
and thin
to
congregation,
pray and
enthusiastic,
praise.
crowded assemblies meet together to
Mae'r
pray
un
and praise.
y peth yn wir am I weinidogaeth
And the same is true
Wrexham hefyd.
of his
Os
ministry.
ydych chi wedi bod I Eglwys San Silin yn Wrexham,
In Wrexham as well.
gallwch chi feddwl mor anodd fydda llenwi
If you've been or are familiar with St Giles's Church in Wrexham, you can imagine how difficult it would be to fill
I wneud hynny.
all the pews there. But David Howell, Llawdden, succeeded in doing so.
Drwy weinidogaeth ei Gymreigtod. Yr dyn
And he was an enthusiastic proponent of the Welsh language throughout his ministry. Now, this gentleman is
esgob Llanelwy
Alfred George Edwards,
ifanc yn ei oes ac yn
who became
esgob cyntaf
Bishop
Cymru
of St Asaph
pan ddatgysylltwyd
early on in his career, and the first Archbishop of Wales
doedd AG
following his establishment. Unfortunately, A.G. Edwards wasn't very keen on the Welsh language itself, and he was a staunch opponent of disestablishment. It's rather ironic, therefore, that he became the first Archbishop. A great deal of tension existed between David Howell and Bishop Edwards. Firstly, because of Llawdden stand for the language, for holding Welsh services in Wrexham.
Ecumenaidd y cry ac o'n ni glywed mwy am hynny'n benodol.
And also because of his strong ecumenical tendencies. We'll hear more of that specifically later on.
Deimlad ma'n rhywbeth personol iawn. Dwi ddim yn deud o ochr David Howell, and
ill will grew into something very personal. Not so much on David Howell's side, but certainly from that of the bishop. Because many people who studied this period have asked, well, why wasn't David Howell's elevated to be a bishop? Well, it was A.G. Edwards' work and his fault. Oh, and by the way, Bishop Edwards' brother, Henry Thomas Edwards, was wholly supportive of the Welsh language. He became Dean of Bangor.
byddai frawd wedi wneud, a mae'n ddiddorol yn dychmygu
and his views were in total contrast to those of his brother. It would be interesting to speculate, indeed perhaps to write a short play on the conversation between the brothers. Sadly, Henry Thomas Edwards committed suicide in 1884. He suffered from depression and a lack of confidence. But it's interesting to think of two such different characters. However, the truth is, I mentioned the marriage of David Howell and Anne Powell. In fact, a child of theirs was conceived and possibly born before their wedding, when David Howell was 19 years old, probably as a result of the Welsh custom of bundling, when two lovers who appeared to be committed to spending their lives together later on could sleep together, fully clothed and separated by the said bundle. This was, of course, supposed to prevent anything untoward from happening. Obviously, it didn't always work, and the passions of youth overcame any obstacle. This was the case with David Howell, and it happened well before he espoused any Christian conviction. But Bishop Edwards used this against him and sought to prevent him also from being made Archdeacon of Wrexham. He was unsuccessful in this, but it appears because the appointment of bishops lay with the Church of England and ultimately the Crown, his influence prevented any further promotion for David Howell. And then his ecumenism. This is a photograph I myself took of St. Giles's Church, Wrexham, with the moon in the background. And in Wrexham, he established, as he did in other places, a Sunday school, not only for children, but for all ages. And it seems at one time that there were 1,000 people attending Sunday school classes, including a large number of nonconformists. And he retained his links with nonconformism and retained his respect towards it, which he made clear in many of his sermons and homilies. And he was respected for this. By the way, One thing I should have mentioned about his adherence to Welsh was how he took the name, the bardic name of Llawdden. Ieuan of Llawdden was a poet from the 15th century, a priest, Catholic at that time, of course, and that might be another indication of David Howell's broad-minded attitude towards other sections of the church. But Llawdden was the subject of the research thesis of the mother of our translator today, Mary Ellis. Now these days, we remember hardly any of old Llawdden's work, apart from one couplet, which I'm sure is familiar to many of us. O blino, treiglo, bob tre, teg edrych tuag adref. So he deserves being remembered for that alone. He's left that mark. But David Howell was also a poet and a writer of hymns. We've no time today to go into more detail, but he was one of those who didn't follow the trend of so many Welsh poets of the 19th century of falling into verbosity and writing 3,000-line odes. He had a poet's true spirit. And as we draw to a close, what drew my attention to him, and some of these words are on his memorial tablet in St. David's Cathedral. This is what he said a few months before his death in 1903. Take note, if I knew that this would be my final message to my compatriots, the length and breadth of Wales, before being summoned to judgment, and with a light eternal already approaching, it is this, that the chief need of my country and beloved nation at this time is a spiritual reawakening through a particular outpouring of the Holy Spirit, a spiritual reawakening, not a revival, but a reawakening, a spiritual high tide flowing over the entire land, infusing each section of society with a baptism of the Holy Spirit. And of course, that's what happened within less than a year of his death. And lastly and briefly, because time is pressing, I'll come to the implications of his life for us today. And this slide illustrates the bridge between the Cathedral Palace and the old Bishop's Palace in St. David's. And I would summarize the contribution in the proverb from the Mabinogi, Afo Ben bid bont, let him who would be a leader be a bridge. That is, he was a bridge, certainly in the church and society, in his ideas and his missionary activity. He was a bridge also between the Anglicization of the church in many places, notably from the direction of the Bishop of St. Asaph at the time, and his own nature and ethos, and that of his nation. And he was also a bridge, not only between the various denominations, but between the different factions in the church at the time. Those who were fiercely opposed to disestablishment, and the other people who were fervently for it. He stood somewhere in the middle. His view was that disestablishment would do the church no harm, but didn't actively campaign for it. And had he become a bishop, he could have been a bridge. Despite his evangelical zeal, between them and the Anglo-Catholic element of the church, prominent at the time. So there we are. Thank you for listening. And please contact me if you have any further questions or comments. Thank you very much, John Aled, for your contribution. It's very interesting to hear about both personalities, both of whom were evangelicals and patriots. Do people have any questions? May I begin, Hywel, please? Thank you, Sean Aled. I've been interested in Llawdden for years, possibly for the same reason as you. Namely, the prophetic address he gave in 1903, which was really most exciting. There you are, a man in advanced years, but remembering childhood amongst the Methodists and church people of Glamorgan, when the connection between these movements was a living entity. Because his father was a Methodist, John Hywel, and as it happens, I have a volume here, Colofn y Bardd, the poet's column, by John Hywel, his father, was not only a deacon, but a poet. And for us from Glamorgan, like Hywel here, we don't regard that part of the Vale as somewhere where the Welsh language and culture flourished, but it did. And Llawdden passes lot with poets. Yeah. Not just churchmen, but just poets. They were his friends. But once he realized his calling was for the church, the poetry became sidelined, and he devoted himself to his ministry. And of course, the poet Walter Williams says that in me, praise is one. You feel the same with him. There are Pwllheli in Diocese of Bangor, Cardiff in Llandar, Wrexham and Gresford in St Asaph, and ended up in St David's. He was a man of the whole nation. And I remember Principal Tudur Jones saying this. I've not found any evidence, but this is what he said. Gwilym Hiraethog, bearing in mind vicious polarization between church and chapel towards the end of the century. One factor being H. Edwards. But there were extremists on both sides, of course, and they were poles apart. But there were many in the middle, and Llawdden was one of them. And I remember Tudur saying, Gwilym Hiraethog's comment was supposed to have been, if the church in Wales was sensible, they should disestablish themselves and appoint Llawdden as Archbishop. Indeed, indeed. So the non-conformists and people also saw there were some good people in the church. and we can work together. But thank you very much. Any other questions? If I may ask one thing, what do you think was in David Howell's mind when he drew the distinction between regeneration and revival? Does it suggest that he didn't want to see a revival in the church? Ah, well, when I first read those words in the 80s, what I took it to mean was that we in Welsh use the word diwygiad to mean revival and reformation, don't we? I don't think, this is just my opinion, I don't think he said that the church didn't need to reform, but that Wales needed more. And perhaps that might have been a reflection of the way after the Calvinistic Methodists left the church, there was so much emphasis on the theological niceties that we had to go beyond that and bring in a regeneration. Of course, in English, you haven't got this ambiguity. You have reformation, changing things, we hope, for the better, and revival, which means regeneration. So that's what I took from it. Well, thank you. We'll bring things to a conclusion, and I would like to thank our two speakers. Thank you for your work and for your presentations. I want to thank also the people, not the people beyond the veil, but behind the scenes, to make sure that everything is working smoothly. Session. And everyone and Harald. Very well. We'll wait. You can stay for half an hour and have a chat or whatever. But the formal session is now ended. And we can question more informally. Thank you all very much for your presence.